James Dunn hung by his fingertips from the windowsill and after a moment dropped noiselessly to the ground. He looked about him hurriedly. The house was on the outskirts of the town, well back from the road from which the grounds were separated by a high stone wall. It was almost 2 o'clock and the night was dark. There was little likelihood of his meeting anybody at that time. On the whole, he was perfectly secure. As he ran silently across the lawn, he could not help marveling at his own nerve. He had committed burglaries in those far-off days before he had blossomed forth as a respectable jeweler in the little town of Brampton, but those days were far distant. Behind him lay 10 years of law-abiding respectability. The hand that reached up to grasp the top of the wall was as steady as a rock. He could even think calmly of the still thing which had once been Richard Strong and which now lay huddled up in an ever-widening crimson pool in the room which he had just left. He had not intended to commit murder, but circumstances had rendered it inevitable. He felt that all through he had been the plaything of circumstances. His troubles had begun when an old prison acquaintance had recognized him again. Blackmail followed. Dunn's business was prosperous, but the blackmailer's ever-increasing demands were a drain greater than he could bear. He tried to supplement his resources by gambling, only to plunge more deeply into the mire, until finally ruin stared him in the face. At his wits' end he turned to his old trade. Richard Strong was a retired solicitor, with more than a local reputation as a collector of antiques, and he was believed to possess ancient gold ornaments of fabulous value. Dunn at that time was purchasing gold, old rings, brooches and so on, and melting them down. Therefore the proceeds of a burglary of Strong's house could be disposed of safely and lucratively. It was an easy matter to break into the house. He knew the room in which the collection was kept, and all that had to be done was to climb a drain pipe for a few feet to reach a window. In Brampton it was not thought necessary to take precautions against burglars. When Dunn had stuffed his pockets with the gold ornaments, of which there were many in the room, they held a small fortune. He was preparing to go when he heard a gasp behind him. He swung round to find that the door of the room had opened and that Strong himself was standing in front of him. "Dunn, it was the only word Strong uttered. Dunn had been glancing at an oriental knife of curious workmanship. He still held it in his hand, and almost without thinking, lunged at Strong. All was over. Dunn dragged the body into the room, closed the door, switched off the light, drew back the curtains, and left as he had come, through the window. He felt no remorse. "I could do nothing else," he told himself. He recognized me, and it was that or prison. He recalled the look of surprise on Strong's face and actually smiled. He really did not think that he had anything with which to reproach himself. Strong's death was necessary for his own safety, and there was no alternative to what he had done. In any case, he was an old man with only a few more years to live. He felt safe. Who would suspect the dull, stodgy middle-aged jeweler of murder and robbery? He had left no clue. He had met nobody, either going or coming. The little main street was deserted and in complete darkness as he let himself into his house by the side door. He lived alone in the house. A woman came in daily and did for him, but nobody except himself slept on the premises. His bedroom was at the back, but before switching on the electric light he pulled down the blind and drew the heavy curtains across the window. Then he fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a glove. With a look of surprise he searched the pocket again, and not finding what he sought, plunged his hand into all his other pockets, fumbling amongst the gold articles with which they were filled. The latter he did not take out. For some strange reason he feared to look at them, and he did not intend to empty his pockets of them until he was ready to place them in the crucible in the little room behind shop downstairs. Finally he abandoned the search and stood in the middle of the room, his face a white mask of sheer horror. The other glove was missing. He had found the gloves in his pocket while in Strong's house, and he had taken them out and placed them on a table before stowing away his foot. He could have sworn he had replaced them before his hasty departure, but here was the appalling fact that one of them was missing, and on the lining was his name and address. The thought of returning to the house, to the room where Strong lay so quiet and still, filled him with a kind of superstitious horror. The memory of the dead man's upturned face with the queer look of surprise by death returned to him, and he gave a little strangled scream. He stood in the middle of the room, his face white and speckled with drops of perspiration, and his mind a welter of indecision. "I can't do it," he muttered. "I can't." And then the vision of the scaffold intruded itself. He shivered as with an awe, his body cold. In his criminal days he had possessed a morbid dread of the scaffold. The old fear now held him in its grip. With lagging footsteps he went out into the dark, deserted street. The journey was like a nightmare. To his disordered imagination every dark corner concealed a spectre, and once he screamed hoarsely at the sight of a discarded piece of wrapping paper which lay across his path. For a moment it had seemed to him like a corpse lying in a dark pool. He reached his destination, and bathed in perspiration and trembling in every limb he climbed to the window. The room was in darkness as he had left it, but he thought he could perceive a darker object on the floor near the door. He must have light to find the glove, and the switch was near the body. Calling to his aid all the reserves of his willpower, he drew the hangings across the window, and he recoiled with a hoarse gasp, his heart pounding furiously. His shaking fingers found the switch and the room was flooded with light. Richard Strong lay at his feet. He would have given all the world to have been able to keep his gaze averted, but the body exercised some dreadful fascination over him, and drew his eyes irresistibly. More, filled with repugnance as he was, he bent forwards, his hand outstretched to touch the hilt of the knife. "Put up your hands. Good God! Put up your hands, you scoundrel!" He looked up. The door had opened, and Strong's son stood there, covering him with a revolver. Slowly he raised his arms above his head. The inspector who escorted Dunn to the police station was garrulous and, moreover, appeared to have temporarily forgotten that, in the eyes of the law, an accused man is innocent until he is proved guilty. At any rate, he assumed Dunn's guilt, which, considering the evidence, is not surprising. "Do you know," he said, "that you are the last man I would have suspected? If you hadn't been found in the room with the body and the loot in your pockets, we'd never have thought of you. Unluckily for you, you didn't get away in time." Dunn made no reply. His house was on the way to the police station, and he asked permission to get an overcoat. The air was chilly, in that dark hour before the dawn. "Certainly," said the inspector, "but we'll go with you." He opened the side door and preceded his prisoner into the hall, two policemen bringing up the rear. Dunn was thinking that they intended taking no chances, when his foot touched something on the floor. He stooped to pick it up and suddenly felt queer. Then the inspector switched on the light. Dunn looked at the article in his hand. It was the glove which he thought he had left in the room with the murdered man, and which he had gone back to find. "Here!" shouted one of the policemen. "Hold up, man!" But Dunn slipped through his hands and fell to the floor.